I'll call the Border Patrol.
No.
My orders are to take them back with me.
These illegals are mine.
I'm not going to ask again. The woman and the boy. Hand them over.
This ain't worth it, boys.
The story begins in Mexico, where a young boy named Miguel lives a simple life with his mother, Rosa. One afternoon, while Rosa is cooking at home, she receives a frantic phone call from her brother, Carlos. Terrified and out of breath, Carlos reveals that a powerful drug cartel is hunting him down. He recently stole a large amount of their cash, and now they want him dead. Knowing he has little time left, Carlos begs Rosa to find the money he secretly hid for her. He warns her to take Miguel and leave Mexico immediately before it's too late. But moments after the call ends, Carlos's worst fear becomes reality. The cartel catches up to him. Their ruthless leader, Mauricio, grabs Carlos's phone and checks his recent calls. One name instantly catches his attention, Rosa. That's all the proof he needs. Mauricio realizes Rosa may know where the missing money is hidden, and with no mercy left to show, the cartel executes Carlos on the spot. Now Rosa and Miguel have no idea that a deadly cartel is already coming for them, and their lives are about to change forever. Meanwhile, across the border in Arizona, a retired Marine named Jim spends his days working alone on his remote ranch near the US-Mexico border. Jim keeps a close eye on his property. Whenever he spots illegal border crossings, he immediately reports them to Border Patrol. One day, while checking on his livestock, Jim notices a small group of people moving through the desert. Sensing something suspicious, he quickly radios their location to the authorities. Curious, he decides to follow from a safe distance. That's when he discovers something disturbing. The group had abandoned one of their own. A badly injured man was lying in the desert with a severely wounded leg. Unable to keep up, he had been left behind to die. Jim immediately contacts Border Patrol and reports the man's exact location before heading back toward his ranch. Speaking into his radio, he calmly says, "This is Handsome. Send a medic out here. We've got one left behind. Over." After returning to his ranch, Jim's problems only get worse. A bank representative shows up to remind him that he's fallen far behind on his loan payments. For 6 months, Jim hasn't been able to make a single payment, and now the bank is preparing to foreclose on his property. The truth is heartbreaking. During his wife's long battle with illness, Jim spent nearly everything he had on medical expenses. The savings he worked his entire life to build disappeared, leaving him buried in debt. The banker makes it clear, if Jim can't come up with the money, he'll lose the ranch. Desperate, Jim asks for more time. He explains that he's not running away from his responsibilities, he just needs one chance to get back on his feet. The banker finally gives him an ultimatum: 90 days. If he can't pay what he owes by then, the ranch is gone. Determined not to quit, Jim starts searching for work, but every door seems to close in his face. At an employment office, he's told that there aren't many opportunities for someone his age. The employee promises to keep an eye out for future openings, but that's little comfort right now. Running out of options, Jim drives to a local cattle buyer, hoping to sell the few cows he has left. The offer he receives is devastatingly low. Even if he sold everything, it wouldn't be enough to make a real dent in his debt. Exhausted, frustrated, and feeling trapped, Jim ends his long day at a nearby bar. He hopes a couple of drinks might help him forget his troubles for a while, but his pain is impossible to hide. The bartender notices how worn down Jim looks and becomes concerned. Knowing someone who might help, he calls Sarah, Jim's stepdaughter, who works for Border Patrol. Sarah arrives shortly afterward and takes a seat beside him. The two talk quietly for a while, and eventually Jim admits the truth. He's drowning in debt and standing on the edge of losing everything he has left. As the night goes on, Jim orders another drink, but Sarah gently stops him. Instead, she takes his keys and drives him safely back to the ranch, knowing that deep down, he's carrying far more than financial problems on his shoulders. Meanwhile, Rosa and Miguel are still on the run, desperately trying to stay one step ahead of the cartel. The next day, near the US-Mexico border, they discover a narrow opening in a long steel fence. With the cartel closing in fast, they make a desperate attempt to slip through unnoticed. By pure coincidence, Jim happens to be nearby and spots the frightened mother and son crossing through the fence. Terrified and out of options, Rosa begs him not to report them. Jim is cautious but not hostile, unsure of what's really happening. He tells Rosa that Border Patrol can help and starts reaching for his phone. That's when everything changes. Several armed cartel members suddenly appear, led by the ruthless Mauricio. They demand that Jim hand over Rosa and Miguel immediately. Realizing the danger they're in, Jim makes a split-second decision. He's not giving them up. Gunfire erupts across the desert. Drawing on his Marine training, Jim fires back and drops one of the attackers with a precise shot. He then rushes Rosa and Miguel into his truck and speeds away as bullets tear through the air behind them. But the chase is far from over. Mauricio and his men pursue them across the desert, determined to get the boy back. During the high-speed pursuit, Mauricio even manages to climb onto Jim's truck. Before he can take control, Jim fights him off and throws him back into the dirt. Then Mauricio learns the truth. The man Jim shot wasn't just one of his soldiers, it was his own brother. At that moment, the mission becomes personal. This is no longer about stolen cartel money. Mauricio now wants revenge, and he'll stop at nothing to get it. As Jim continues driving, he notices that Rosa has been hit during the shootout. The wound is severe. She's struggling to breathe, growing weaker with every passing second. Knowing she doesn't have much time left, Rosa pulls out a folded piece of paper containing an address in Chicago. She explains that family members live there and begs Jim to take Miguel to them. With tears in her eyes, she warns him that if the cartel finds her son, they'll kill him. Jim promises to protect the boy. Moments later, Rosa quietly closes her eyes for the last time. Now Jim isn't just running from a cartel. He's carrying the final promise of a dying mother. A short time later, police and paramedics arrive at the scene. Sarah informs Jim that Miguel will spend the night at the station before being transferred into foster care the next day. The following morning, Jim wakes up in his truck near a border checkpoint. His loyal dog, Jackson, is sleeping beside him. As he looks around, something immediately catches his attention. Parked nearby is a vehicle he recognizes from the previous day's attack, the same one used by the cartel during the chase. Then, Jim discovers something even more shocking. Inside his truck is a bag Rosa left behind. When he opens it, he finds it packed with cash. But instead of seeing an opportunity to solve his own financial problems, Jim sees something else. He notices Rosa's blood-stained belongings, and memories of her final moments come rushing back. Her desperate plea, her fear for Miguel, her last request. Suddenly, the money isn't a lifeline for him anymore. It's a responsibility, a promise. Remembering Rosa's dying wish, Jim starts his truck and heads out to find Miguel before it's too late. He rushes to the Border Patrol station, hoping to check on the boy. Once there, an officer tells him that Miguel is about to be handed over to relatives in Mexico, but something doesn't feel right. Looking out the window, Jim spots several men waiting outside. He recognizes them instantly, cartel members. Keeping his composure, Jim asks the officer if he can speak with Miguel alone for a few minutes. The request seems harmless, and the officer agrees. The moment Jim enters the room, he goes into action. Without wasting a second, he quietly guides Miguel through a hallway and slips out a side exit, avoiding everyone else's attention. Minutes later, Jim and Miguel disappear into the daylight once again. Meanwhile, in the parking lot, Mauricio watches it all unfold. He stands silently as Jim's truck drives away with the boy inside. The rage on his face says everything. At that moment, Mauricio makes a final decision. He's done waiting. He will cross into the United States himself, hunt them down, and make sure neither Jim nor Miguel survives. Back in Arizona, Jim makes a brief stop at his ranch. Knowing they're about to disappear for a while, he gathers some clothes, a few weapons, and whatever cash he has left. But when he returns to his truck, he discovers that Miguel is gone. At the same time, Mauricio and his men illegally cross the border into the United States. A border officer spots them and immediately recognizes who they are. He knows they're cartel enforcers, and dangerous ones at that. Afraid for his own safety, he lets them pass without a fight. Fortunately, Jim finds Miguel not far from the ranch. He warns the boy that if the cartel catches him, they won't show any mercy. This time, Miguel understands. With no other options left, the two begin their journey toward Chicago. As they drive, Jim explains that he's taking Miguel to his relatives. The boy sits in silence, never responding. Jim assumes Miguel doesn't understand English, but he's about to be proven wrong. Meanwhile, Mauricio arrives at Jim's ranch. He kicks down the front door and tears through every room searching for clues. Eventually, he finds old credit card receipts and a retired Marine Corps badge. The discovery changes everything. Jim isn't just some stubborn old rancher, he's a trained Marine, and that makes him far more dangerous than Mauricio originally thought. Smiling coldly, Mauricio pockets the badge and orders his men to burn the place down. Within minutes, Jim's ranch is engulfed in flames, destroying the home he spent years building. Later, Jim stops at a gas station to fill up his truck and buys a paper map to help navigate the long trip to Chicago. At the same time, Mauricio uses the receipts from the ranch to contact cartel associates already operating inside the United States. A little later, Jim calls Sarah. That's when he learns the devastating news. His ranch is gone. Everything has been destroyed. Furious, Jim starts venting his frustration while driving. Then something unexpected happens. Miguel quietly responds in perfect English. Jim is stunned. The boy has understood every word he said from the very beginning. Miguel finally admits that he doesn't want to stay with those people and doesn't know who he can trust anymore. Jim reassures him that he's only trying to do what's best and reminds him that they're heading to his family in Chicago. But while Jim and Miguel are talking, a serious mistake comes back to haunt them. The gas station purchase Jim made with his credit card has exposed their location. Within minutes, Mauricio receives the alert. He and his men race to the station. Once there, Mauricio calmly walks inside and begins questioning the cashier about Jim. The woman refuses to cooperate and insists she doesn't know anything. Mauricio doesn't hesitate. He pulls out a gun and shoots her before walking away. After reviewing the station's security footage, he finally gets the information he needs. Jim is heading east, and now the cartel is right behind him. A few hours later, trouble strikes again. Jim's truck suddenly breaks down on a lonely stretch of road, forcing them to tow it to a nearby repair shop. Unfortunately, they're out of luck. The mechanic apologizes and explains that the garage is already closed for the day. The truck won't be looked at until morning. With nowhere else to go, Jim takes Miguel to a small roadside diner nearby. For the first time since they met, the two actually sit down and talk. The awkward silence between them begins to fade. They introduce themselves properly, and Jim finally asks the question that's been bothering him all along. Why are those men so desperate to find you? Miguel lowers his head and quietly explains explains that his uncle got involved in serious trouble with the cartel. Whatever happened, it was big enough to put a target on his entire family. Now he's paying the price for someone else's mistake. As the conversation continues, Jim asks about Miguel's father. The boy pauses for a moment before answering. His father died before he was even born. The response hits Jim harder than he expected. For a brief moment, he sees more than just a frightened kid sitting across from him. He sees a child who's lost almost everything. By the end of the night, the distance between them has started to disappear. With no hotel and no other options available, Jim and Miguel spend the night sleeping inside the truck, parked outside the repair shop. Neither of them knows it yet, but the bond forming between them is about to be tested in ways they never imagined. The next morning, Jim wakes up to a frightening sight. Miguel and Jackson are both gone. For a moment, panic sets in, but then he spots them walking back toward the truck. Miguel had simply gone to a nearby store to buy breakfast for all of them. Relieved, Jim gets the truck repaired, and the journey continues. Unfortunately, fixing the truck comes with a price. The moment Jim uses his credit card to pay for the repairs, Mauricio receives another alert with their updated location. The hunt is back on. As Jim and Miguel drive east, the relationship between them continues to grow. For the first time, they begin talking like family rather than strangers. Jim shares stories from his younger days, including a trip he once took to Chicago. For a brief moment, everything feels normal. Then flashing red and blue lights appear in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser pulls them over. The officer approaches the truck and asks Jim for identification. Staying calm, Jim explains that he has a legally registered firearm and can provide all the paperwork if necessary. The officer takes possession of the weapon and then says he'd also like to ask Miguel a few questions. Something feels off. Still, Jim cooperates and follows the officer back to the patrol car. Once inside, he notices the officer quietly speaking on his phone, trying to keep the conversation out of earshot. That's when it clicks. This isn't a routine traffic stop. The officer is stalling, and there's only one reason he'd do that. Someone is on the way. Looking him straight in the eye, Jim asks a simple question. How much did they pay you to betray your badge? The officer's expression instantly changes. Realizing he's been exposed, he reaches for his gun. But before he can react, Jackson lunges at him. At the same time, Jim strikes first, knocking the corrupt officer unconscious. Without wasting a second, Jim races back to the truck, grabs Miguel, and speeds away before the cartel can arrive. Not long afterward, Mauricio and his men reach the scene. They find the officer injured and barely conscious. Furious, Mauricio demands to know where Jim went. The officer can't answer. To Mauricio, that's useless. Moments later, he executes the man and begins searching the area for clues. That's when he finds something important, Jim's roadmap. Now he finally knows the route they're taking. From a distance, Jim and Miguel secretly watch the entire encounter unfold. Seeing what happened confirms just how far Mauricio is willing to go. Realizing they're running out of options, Jim stops at a gun shop and buys additional protection for the road ahead. Later, he calls Sarah. During the conversation, she reveals a crucial piece of information. The man Jim shot during the border shootout wasn't just another cartel member. He was Mauricio's brother. Everything suddenly makes sense. This isn't just a cartel operation anymore. It's a personal vendetta. Sarah urges Jim to bring Miguel back and let the authorities handle the situation before things get even worse. At first, Jim reluctantly agrees, but deep down, he already knows it may be too late to turn back now. That night, Jim and Miguel check into a small roadside motel to get some much-needed rest. For the first time since their journey began, they actually relax. Over dinner, they talk for hours, learning more about each other. Miguel admits that when they finally reach Chicago, the first thing he wants to do is eat a real Chicago hot dog. Jim smiles and promises they'll make it happen. For a brief moment, it feels like a normal road trip, then everything changes. A few hours later, Jim wakes up and takes Jackson outside for some fresh air. The second he steps into the cold night, he spots something that makes his blood run cold. Mauricio and his men are searching the motel. Jim immediately rushes back to the room and quietly wakes Miguel. Knowing they have only seconds to act, he places a fake robbery call to the police to create a distraction. Then he helps Miguel climb out through a window, and the two disappear into the darkness. Moments later, cartel gunmen kick down the motel room door. The room is empty. Enraged, Mauricio storms through the parking lot, vowing that he will find Jim no matter what it takes. Meanwhile, Jim tells Miguel to wait in the truck while he goes back for Jackson. But by the time he returns, it's already too late. The loyal dog had stayed behind, barking at Mauricio and his men, refusing to back down. Without a trace of mercy, Mauricio raises his gun and pulls the trigger. The gunshot echoes through the night. The next morning, Jim and Miguel bury Jackson in a quiet spot near the motel. They place a few stones over the grave and stand silently, paying their final respects. For Jim, losing Jackson feels like losing a member of his family. Later, Miguel discovers the bag of cartel money hidden in the truck. Angry and hurt, he accuses Jim of helping him only because of the cash. Jim denies it immediately, but Miguel isn't convinced and storms off. Fortunately, after cooling down, the boy returns. Both of them realize they've said things they didn't mean, and they apologize to each other before continuing the journey. A little farther down the road, they stop at a small church. Inside, Miguel kneels at the altar and quietly prays for his mother. Jim stands nearby, watching in silence. When the priest approaches and gently asks if Miguel is his grandson, Jim shakes his head. Then he tells him the truth. He made a promise to the boy's mother, and he's going to keep it. Later, Jim calls Sarah and updates her on everything that's happened. Desperate to protect him, Sarah pleads with Jim to turn Miguel over to the authorities. The situation has become far too dangerous, but Jim refuses. He gave Rosa his word. No No matter the cost, he's going to see this through. He tells Sarah that he's taking Miguel to his family in Chicago, and that's exactly where they're going. As Jim and Miguel continue making their way toward Chicago, Mauricio and his men work relentlessly to track them down. They search every clue, every lead, and every piece of evidence they can find. Then they discover something important. On the road map they stole earlier, a red circle had been marked around the Chicago area. That was all Mauricio needed. Their destination had finally been revealed. Without wasting any time, he contacts cartel associates already operating in the city and orders them to prepare for an ambush the moment Jim and Miguel arrive. Meanwhile, the journey continues. One afternoon, Miguel notices Jim practicing with his rifle during a break. Curious, he walks over to watch. Jim decides to teach him a few basics: how to aim properly, how to handle a firearm safely, and how to disassemble and reassemble it. As they train together, Miguel suddenly admits something that's been growing inside him ever since his mother's death. One day, he wants to kill the men who murdered her. The statement immediately catches Jim's attention. He firmly tells Miguel that taking a life isn't something to be proud of. There's no honor in revenge. Jim reminds him that Rosa didn't sacrifice herself so he could spend the rest of his life consumed by hatred. She died so he could have a future, a better future. The lesson stays with Miguel as they continue down the road. That night, they take shelter beneath an old overpass. The temperature drops and they build a small fire to stay warm. With nothing else available, they begin feeding bundles of cartel cash into the flames. The money that once caused so much death and suffering means nothing to them now. At this point, survival is worth far more than any amount of cash. As the fire burns through the night, Jim and Miguel sit quietly beside it, knowing that Chicago is getting closer, and so is Mauricio. By the next morning, Jim and Miguel finally reach the outskirts of Chicago. For the first time, it feels like they're close to the finish line, but Mauricio is already waiting. While driving along the highway, Jim notices two suspicious men standing on an overpass, watching the road below. His instincts immediately kick in. Something isn't right. Realizing they may have been spotted, Jim quickly exits the main highway and heads onto a rural back road, hoping to draw the cartel away from the city and away from Miguel's family. It doesn't take long for the enemy to catch up. Several cartel vehicles appear behind them, rapidly closing the distance. One of the SUVs pulls alongside Jim's truck. Thinking fast, Jim jerks the wheel and forces the vehicle off course. The cartel SUV crashes into a line of trees and explodes into twisted metal, but the escape comes at a cost. Jim notices his truck's radiator is failing. The engine won't last much longer. He pushes the vehicle as far as it can go before finally reaching an isolated stretch of farmland. There he stops. He knows the chase is over. Now it's a fight. Drawing on decades of military experience, Jim grabs his rifle and takes up a strong defensive position. He steadies his breathing, waits, and fires. The shot hits the driver of Mauricio's vehicle. The SUV loses control, flips violently across the field, and crashes in a cloud of dirt and debris. When the wreck finally settles, only Mauricio and two of his men manage to crawl out alive. One of them immediately opens fire toward Jim's position. Bullets tear through the air. Without hesitation, Jim grabs Miguel and pulls him toward a nearby abandoned farmhouse. The two slip inside an old, dusty shed and prepare for a final stand. Jim positions himself beside a broken window, rifle in hand. Before the shooting starts again, he looks at Miguel and gives him one final instruction. If anything happens to him, run. Don't look back, just run. Moments later, Jim spots one of the cartel gunmen moving through the field toward the shed. He tightens his grip on the rifle, takes aim, and pulls the trigger. The gunman drops instantly. Now only two enemies remain, and one of them is Mauricio. Thinking quickly, Jim tells Miguel to stay hidden inside the shed and fire a few shots into the air to distract the enemy. The plan works perfectly. As the gunfire echoes across the field, Jim quietly slips out through the other side of the building and circles around unnoticed. One of the remaining cartel gunmen takes the bait. The moment he steps into the open, Jim lines up his shot. One squeeze of the trigger, one perfect hit. The gunman drops instantly. Now only one enemy remains, Mauricio. A few moments later, Mauricio kicks open the shed door and storms inside. Before Miguel can react, Mauricio grabs him and presses a gun against his head. The situation changes in an instant. Mauricio orders Jim to drop his weapon. Knowing he has no choice, Jim slowly lowers his rifle while keeping his eyes locked on the cartel leader. Then Mauricio does something unexpected. He places the gun into Miguel's trembling hands. With a twisted smile, he begins forcing the boy to pull the trigger. He tells Miguel that today he'll become a soldier just like them, that today he'll make his first kill. But Mauricio has made one critical mistake. He doesn't know what Jim taught Miguel. Earlier in their journey, Jim showed him how to safely disassemble and reload a firearm. Using that knowledge, Miguel secretly removes the ammunition without Mauricio noticing. Then he pulls the trigger. Click. Nothing happens. The gun is empty. The realization hits Mauricio instantly. He frantically tries to reload the weapon, but that single mistake gives Jim the opening he needs. He charges forward. The two men crash into each other and begin a brutal fight. Punches fly. Furniture shatters. Both men slam into walls and wrestle across the floor, each trying to gain the upper hand. In the middle of the chaos, Miguel picks up the gun and points it directly at Mauricio. For a moment, everything freezes. But instead of begging for mercy, Mauricio starts provoking him. He wants Miguel to pull the trigger. He wants the boy to become just like him. Jim sees the anger and pain building inside Miguel's eyes. Immediately, he steps between them. He tells Miguel not to listen, not to let revenge define the rest of his life. Killing Mauricio won't bring his mother back, and Rosa never wanted that future for her son. Slowly, Miguel lowers the weapon. Jim takes the gun from his hands. Then he turns toward Mauricio. A single shot rings out. The bullet strikes Mauricio in the stomach, ending the cartel leader's reign of terror once and for all. After shooting Mauricio, Jim tells Miguel to go outside and wait. The boy hesitates for a moment, but eventually listens. Inside the shed, silence takes over. As Jim lowers his weapon, he notices that the badly wounded Mauricio is reaching into his pocket. For a split second, it looks like he's going for another gun. Instead, he pulls out something unexpected. It's Jim's old Marine Corps badge, the one Mauricio stole from the burned-down ranch. Jim takes the badge back and stares at it for a moment. Then he looks at Mauricio and gives him a choice. Two paths. He can die at Jim's hands, or he can make his own final decision. By now, Mauricio knows the fight is over. The hatred that drove him across borders and through countless bodies has led him to this exact moment. Without saying another word, he makes his choice. He slowly turns the gun toward himself. A second later, a final gunshot echoes across the quiet countryside, and just like that, the hunt is over. The danger is gone. With the cartel finally behind them, Jim and Miguel continue their journey. Not long afterward, they arrive at the address Rosa wrote down before she died. Miguel walks up to the front door and knocks. A few moments later, the door opens. Standing there are his grandmother and aunt. For the first time since losing his mother, Miguel is finally home. Overwhelmed with emotion, he turns around, hoping to say goodbye to Jim, but Jim is already gone. He slipped away quietly without asking for thanks or recognition. A short distance away, wounded and exhausted, Jim boards a bus. He takes a seat by the window and gently presses a hand against his injuries. As the bus begins moving, he leans back and closes his eyes. The gunfights, the promise he made to Rosa, the long road that nearly cost him everything.